coordinates were wrong by 400 meters. 400 meters in the geography of the operation sounds, to someone who has not operated in the kind of environment the operation took place in, like a navigational error of the kind that is embarrassing but recoverable. It sounds like a mistake that produces a difficult debrief and a remedial navigation training requirement and an after-action report with a section on what went wrong and how it will be prevented from going wrong again. That is what 400 meters sounds like to someone who has not been in the environment, to the people who were in the environment that night, and to the people who subsequently reviewed what the 400 meters produced. It sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like the most consequential navigational error in the operational history of the combined campaign, and then it sounded like the specific silence that the Pentagon applies to things it has decided the public record cannot contain. The target was a building. The building was in a specific location, in a specific district of a specific city, in a country that the combined intelligence architecture had been operating in for long enough that the target packages for buildings in that district were some of the most thoroughly developed target packages in the combined archive. The intelligence picture for the building had been built across several months through the combination of signals intelligence, human intelligence, and aerial surveillance that the combined architecture applied to high-priority targets, and the picture was assessed at a confidence level that the targeting cell had described as sufficient for action. The building contained, in the assessment of the combined intelligence architecture, a planning element of a network whose activities had been responsible for a sequence of attacks that had killed coalition personnel and civilians over the preceding year. The assessment was credible. The intelligence was sound. The target was real. The coordinates that the SAS patrol received for the target were not the coordinates of the building the intelligence described. They were the coordinates of a building 400 meters from that building, in the same district, in the same general area, with a similar physical profile from aerial imagery. The error was in the targeting cell's data entry. A transposition of 2 digits in a grid reference that moved the target 400 meters northwest of where the target actually was. The transposition was not caught by the verification process that the targeting cell applied to target packages before disseminating them, because the verification process checked the grid reference against the target package's supporting documentation, and the transposition was in the grid reference itself rather than in the documentation it was checked against. The patrol received the coordinates. The patrol planned against the coordinates. The planning was thorough in the way that SAS planning was always thorough, which meant it incorporated every piece of intelligence about the target location that the targeting cell's package contained and that the patrol's own reconnaissance had confirmed. The reconnaissance had confirmed the grid reference. The reconnaissance had confirmed the building at the grid reference. The reconnaissance had confirmed the physical layout, the access routes, the guard disposition, and the pattern of activity at the building the grid reference identified. The building at the wrong coordinates was occupied. It had armed personnel. It had a pattern of activity that was consistent from external observation with the pattern of activity described in the target package for the building 400 meters away. The patrol had no reason to conclude that it was not looking at the target it had been given. The operation launched at 0140. The entry team reached the building at the wrong coordinates and breached it and cleared it with the speed and the precision that the regiment's training produced in the specific circumstances of a building whose layout had been closely observed and whose occupant pattern had been established. The clearance was complete. The building was not what the target package described. The personnel inside were not the personnel the target package identified. The materials inside were not the materials the intelligence assessment had predicted. The building was occupied and it was defended, and the people who defended it were armed, and they were not the people the patrol had come to find. The outcome of the clearance is in the operational record at a classification level that has kept its specifics from any public source. The accounts of people who have knowledge of the classification describe the operational record as containing a full account of what happened inside the building at the wrong coordinates, and of what the patrol did in the time between the entry and the extraction, and those accounts are consistent in describing the operational record as a document that the Pentagon's review process assessed as requiring a classification level above the standard threshold for operational reporting from the combined campaign. The classification was applied within 48 hours of the operation's conclusion. The after-action reporting that would normally have fed into the combined lessons learned process was held at that level rather than being distributed through the combined architecture in the form that would have allowed it to be reviewed by the oversight mechanisms that governed the combined campaign's operational record. The silence that followed the classification was the Pentagon silence, which is a specific institutional instrument that differs from ordinary secrecy in the way that a formal decision differs from an absence of action. The ordinary secrecy of classified operational records is the secrecy of documents in systems that restrict access without anyone having made a specific decision about that particular document's sensitivity beyond the standard classification criteria. The Pentagon's silence on this operation was the silence of a specific institutional decision made at a level of the American command structure that the sources who have described the decision identify as senior, that the circumstances of the operation and its outcome were not circumstances that any form of public record could describe without producing consequences the institution was not prepared to manage. The consequences the institution was not prepared to manage were not primarily the tactical consequences of a navigational error in a direct action operation. Navigational errors in direct action operations were not unknown in the combined campaign's operational history, and the institutional framework had processes for managing the consequences of such errors within the operational and legal frameworks that governed the campaign. The consequences the institution was not prepared to manage were the consequences of a navigational error of this specific kind, in this specific operational context, producing outcomes of this specific character, in circumstances where the institutional framework that would normally have managed them was the institutional framework that had produced the error in the first place. The targeting cell that produced the erroneous coordinates was an American targeting cell. The process that failed to catch the transposition was an American verification process. The target package that contained the wrong grid reference was an American target package. The patrol that received the package and planned against it and executed against it was a British patrol. The building that was entered and cleared by British operators. The outcome was an outcome that British operators produced on the basis of American intelligence in a building that American intelligence had misidentified. The Pentagon's silence was the silence of an institution that understood, with the precision of people who had spent years managing the bilateral operational relationship, that the accurate description of this sequence in any accessible document would be a description that the bilateral operational relationship could not easily sustain in the form the relationship needed to sustain. The accurate description would require saying that an American targeting error had sent a British patrol into the wrong building, that the wrong building had been cleared by British operators who were doing what British operators did when they were sent into a building, which was clearing it with the speed and precision of people who had trained for decades to clear buildings in exactly these conditions, and that the outcome of clearing the wrong building was an outcome that the operational record contained, and that the classification was designed to keep the operational record from making accessible in the form that would allow the sequence to be examined. The SAS has not described the operation. The regiment's institutional culture, which holds the silence about its operations as a professional standard that applies regardless of the circumstances of the operation, means that the silence is not a specific response to the circumstances of this operation, but the application of the standard that applies to everything. The operators who entered the building at the wrong coordinates and cleared it and came back have not described what they found there or what happened in the time between the entry and the extraction. They have not described it in any form that has reached any accessible record. The standard holds for this operation, as it holds for all operations, including the operations where the standard is the instrument of concealment, rather than simply the expression of the institutional culture that the regiment maintains regardless of whether concealment is required. The British government's position on the operation is the position it maintains on all SAS operations, which is that SAS operations are not discussed. The position was not modified by the circumstances of this operation, or by the nature of the targeting error that preceded it, or by the character of the outcome the error produced. The position is absolute, and its absoluteness is not responsive to the specific circumstances of specific operations. It was the position before the operation, and it remained the position after it, and the maintenance of the position after it was both the expression of the institutional culture and the specific protection of the operation from the kind of public examination that the American silence was also designed to prevent. The targeting cell that produced the error continued its work. The verification process that failed to catch the transposition was reviewed and modified in ways that the internal record documents and that the lessons learned process would normally have made available to the combined architecture as a finding about the targeting process. The modification of the verification process was documented and implemented without the documentation being distributed through the combined lessons learned architecture in the form that would have required the error that prompted the modification to be described. The lesson was learned. The record of why the lesson needed to be learned was held at the classification level that kept it from the combined lessons learned distribution. The building at the correct coordinates, the building the intelligence described, was subsequently assessed. The subsequent assessment produced conclusions that the intelligence architecture treated as confirming the original target assessment, and that justified a follow-on operation against the correct building at the correct coordinates. The follow-on operation was conducted by a different element against the correct target using verified coordinates. The outcome of the follow-on operation is in the combined operational record at the standard classification level that the combined campaign applied to direct action operations of that type. The connection between the follow-on operation and the preceding operation against the wrong building is not described in the combined operational record in any accessible form. The two operations are in the record as separate events in the operational timeline, without the relationship between them being the subject of any document in the standard distribution of the combined record. The relationship between them is in the restricted access record alongside the operational account of the first operation and the documentation of the verification process modification and the assessment of the building at the correct coordinates that prompted the follow-on operation. The restricted access record holds the relationship and holds the sequence and holds the full account of what the 400 meters produced, and the people who are cleared to access the restricted record can read the relationship, and the people who are not cannot. The 400 meters is not a large distance in any physical sense. In the context of the operation, it was the distance between the building the intelligence described and the building the patrol entered, and the distance between those two buildings was the distance between an operation that would have been a successful direct action against a priority target and an operation that was the clearance of a building that was not the target. And the distance between those two outcomes is the distance that the Pentagon silence was designed to prevent the public record from measuring. The patrol commander who led the operation has not been identified in any public source. The operators who were part of the patrol have not been identified. The targeting cell officer, whose data entry error produced the wrong coordinates, has not been identified. The senior American officer who made the decision to classify the operational record at the level that kept it from the combined lessons learned distribution has not been identified. The building at the wrong coordinates has not been identified. The building at the correct coordinates has not been identified. The district has not been identified. The city has not been identified. The country has not been identified. The operation does not have a name in any public source because the operation does not have a public existence in any form that a name would attach to. What has a public existence? In the specific and partial form that the accounts of people with direct knowledge of restricted information produce when those people describe what they know in the careful and bounded way that people with direct knowledge of restricted information describe what they know is the shape of what happened. The shape is the 400 meters and the wrong building, and the American targeting error, and the British clearance, and the Pentagon silence, and the classification that buried the operational record, and the lessons learned process that incorporated the lesson without describing the event that made the lesson necessary. The shape is visible to the people who know how to read it and invisible to the people who do not. So when the reading of it produces the specific understanding of what the 400 meters meant and what the silence means and what the buried record contains that the public record was never going to provide. The combined campaign generated many lessons. The lessons that found their way into the combined lessons learned architecture are the lessons that the combined oversight and review processes were able to receive and process in the form that the combined architecture required. The lesson that the 400 meters generated is in the restricted access record in the form that the classification required, and in the verification process modification in the form that the internal implementation of the lesson required. The public lessons learned record does not contain a gap in the shape of the 400 meters. It does not record an absence where the lesson should be. It contains the lesson without the event, the modification without the error, the improvement without the reason for the improvement. The reason is in the restricted access record. The restricted access record is in the system. The system is in the building that does not appear on any map you are permitted to read. The SAS patrol completed the operation and came back. The regiment does not describe what its patrols do on operations. The patrol came back from the wrong building, having done what the regiment trained its patrols to do when they entered buildings. And the description of what that means in the specific case of this specific wrong building is in the operational record at its classification level, alongside the targeting cell's data entry error and the verification process failure and the American decision to classify and the British silence and the 400 meters that separated the building, the intelligence described from the building the patrol entered and cleared. The accidental raid is in the record. The record is not accessible. The Pentagon has not confirmed the operation publicly and has not confirmed the silence publicly and has not confirmed the classification publicly. The silence is its own confirmation of a kind, visible to the people who understand what the silence confirms and invisible to the people who see only the absence of a statement. The absence of a statement about an operation of this character in an institutional environment where the absence of statements about operations is the standard practice rather than the specific exception is not itself evidence of the operation's existence. It is simply the silence of institutions that do not discuss their operations, which is the standard silence that covers everything and that covers this along with everything else. The 400 meters is in the silence. The silence covers the 400 meters and the wrong building and the outcome of the clearance and the verification process failure and the classification decision and the lessons learned record that contains the lesson without the event. The patrol went to the wrong building because the coordinates were wrong. The patrol cleared the building because that is what SAS patrols do with the buildings they are sent to. The outcome is in the classification. The classification is in the system. The system holds the 400 meters, and the silence holds the system, and the Pentagon has decided that is where both will remain. The Combined Campaigns Operational Archive is a record of what happened across the years of the deployment, held at the classification levels that each document's content required and distributed through the oversight and review systems that the respective institutional frameworks of the participating nations governed. The archive holds victories and failures and the events that fall between those categories because the categories are insufficient to describe everything that happens in the kind of operational environment the combined campaign occupied. The 400 meters falls between the categories in the specific way that events fall between categories when the categories are defined by the institutions that conduct the review, and when the institutions that conduct the review are the institutions whose processes produce the event being reviewed. The targeting cell's data entry error was a human error of the kind that human beings make in operational environments, where the volume of target packages and the tempo of the targeting cycle and the sustained pressure of the operational pace create conditions that institutional verification processes are designed to mitigate and that the mitigation sometimes fails to prevent. The error was not unusual in its type. Errors of this type had occurred in the combined campaign's targeting process before and had been caught by the verification process that this error evaded. The error was unusual in what it produced, which was the specific combination of circumstances that the classification was designed to prevent the record from describing in the accessible form that the classification removed it from. The verification process modification that followed the error was designed to prevent the type of error from recurring in a way that produced the type of outcome that the classification was holding. The modification was technical and procedural and implementable within the targeting cell's operational framework without requiring the disclosure of the event that prompted it. The implementation was documented at the restricted level that held the event alongside it. The combined lessons learned record received the modification as an improvement to the verification process without receiving the account of what the unverified error had produced. The record learned the lesson. The record did not receive the teaching. The teaching is in the restricted archive, where the operational account of the 400 meters sits alongside the data entry error and the verification process failure and the classification decision and the subsequent assessment of the correct building and the follow-on operation against the correct target. The restricted archive is the complete record of the sequence that the 400 meters produced. The complete record is complete in the way that restricted archives are complete, which is the way of completeness that is available only to the people whose clearances give them access to the restriction that holds it. The 400 meters is a precise measurement of a specific distance between two buildings in a specific district of a specific city in a country whose operational environment the combined campaign occupied for years. It is also a measurement of the distance between an operational record that the combined campaign's institutional framework was prepared to contain and an operational record that the same framework decided it was not prepared to contain. The two buildings are 400 meters apart. The two records are separated by a classification decision that placed one in the combined archive standard distribution and one in the restricted access system that the standard distribution does not reach. The distance between the records is the distance of the classification. The distance of the classification is the measurement of what the 400 meters produced that the combined campaign's institutional framework was not prepared to describe. The patrol came back from the wrong building. The American targeting cell produced the error. The verification process failed to catch it. The classification covered the outcome. The silence held the classification. The 400 meters is in the restricted archive where the silence and the classification keep it alongside the complete record of what the wrong building contained and what the patrol did there and what came back from there and what the operational record says about it at the classification level that prevents the operational record from saying it anywhere. The oversight and review processes of the combined campaign's institutional framework can reach. The follow-on operation against the correct building at the correct coordinates produced results that the combined intelligence assessment rated as significant. The results are in the combined operational record at the standard distribution level. They are in the record as the outcomes of an operation against a target that the combined intelligence architecture had been developing for several months and that the direct action had successfully addressed. They are not in the record as the outcomes of a corrective operation prompted by a targeting error that had sent a British patrol into the wrong building 400 meters from the correct one. The corrective character of the follow-on operation is in the restricted archive where the complete sequence is held. The combined record has the result. The restricted archive has the reason the result required two operations rather than one, and what the first of the two operations produced in the building 400 meters from the one the intelligence had described. The patrol commander received the wrong coordinates through the standard distribution channel of the combined targeting architecture. The standard distribution channel carried the target package from the targeting cell to the patrol's planning element in the form that the combined architecture had developed across years of combined operations to efficiently convey the intelligence and operational detail that a direct action patrol required to plan and execute against a specific target. The efficiency of the channel was the product of the investment both sides had made in building the combined architecture into the integrated and effective instrument that the combined campaign required. The efficiency was real. The error it distributed was also real. The efficiency of the distribution made the error as efficiently delivered as the correct target packages that the same channel had distributed across the preceding years of operations. The patrol received the correct format and the correct supporting documentation and the wrong coordinates, and the combination of the correct format and the correct supporting documentation and the wrong coordinates was the combination that the verification process had failed to identify as incorrect, and the combination that the verification process had failed to identify as incorrect was the combination that the patrol planned against and executed against, and that produced the outcome the restricted archive holds. The restricted archive holds the outcome. The combined record holds the subsequent result. The silence holds the connection between the outcome and the result, and the 400 meters that separated the building where the outcome occurred from the building where the result was eventually achieved. The Pentagon decided the connection was not a connection the combined record could contain. The decision is in the restricted archive, alongside the connection it was made to protect. The protection has held. The public record does not contain the connection. The public record contains the result of the follow-on operation, and the lessons learned improvement to the verification process, and the silence where the event that connected the result to the improvement would have been if the classification had not been applied to keep it out of the accessible record that the silence protects. The 400 meters remains in the restricted archive where the classification placed it. The patrol that went to the wrong building came back from the wrong building, having done what the regiment does with buildings it is sent into. The regiment does not describe what it does with buildings it is sent into. The classification does not describe what the patrol did in the wrong building. The silence covers both the classification and the regiment's silence, and the 400 meters between the building that was entered and cleared and the building that the intelligence had described, and that was subsequently addressed in a separate operation at the correct coordinates that the corrected verification process had confirmed before the follow-on operation was planned and executed. 400 meters. The distance from the correct building to the wrong one. The distance from the operational record the combined campaign was prepared to hold to the operational record the combined campaign was not prepared to hold. The distance the Pentagon's silence covers. The distance the restricted archive holds. The distance that the patrol crossed twice, once to reach the wrong building and once to leave it, and that the classification crossed once in the direction of the restricted access system, where it has remained with the complete account of what 400 meters between two buildings in a district of a city in a country the combined campaign occupied produced on the night the wrong coordinates were distributed through the most efficient targeting architecture in the history of combined operations and received by the most capable direct action patrol in the coalition and acted upon with the precision and speed that made the outcome inevitable once the coordinates were wrong and the patrol was committed and the building at the wrong coordinates was entered and the clearance began. The people who know what the operational record at its classification level contains have carried that knowledge in the way that people carry knowledge that exists in a restricted space between what they are cleared to know and what they are permitted to say. They carry it without the kind of visible weight that knowledge of consequential things sometimes produces in the people who carry it, because the weight has been distributed across a professional discipline that makes the carrying of restricted knowledge a functional practice rather than an exceptional burden. They have been carrying restricted knowledge since the beginning of their careers in the environments that the combined campaign occupied. And the addition of this specific restricted knowledge to the body of restricted knowledge they already carry has not changed the character of the carrying. It has added to it. The character of the carrying is the character it has always been, which is the character of professional discipline, applied to the distinction between what the clearance knows and what the conversation permits. And that discipline holds for this knowledge as it holds for all the knowledge the clearance encompasses. What the discipline permits, in the careful and bounded accounts that constitute the partial public record of what the classification holds, is the shape of the 400 meters and the wrong building and the targeting cell error and the verification process failure and the classification decision and the Pentagon silence. The shape is what the accounts describe when the accounts are placed alongside each other and compared against the combined record that the classification has kept them from completing, and the shape produces the inference that the buried record confirms for the people whose clearances give them access to the confirmation. The inference is the thing the Pentagon decided the public record could not contain in the form the confirmation required. The inference is available to anyone who knows the shape. The shape is in the partial public record. The partial public record is what the accounts of the people who carry the restricted knowledge have produced in the register that the discipline permits. The register produces shapes, not confirmations. The shapes point toward the confirmations. The confirmations are in the restricted access record where the classification placed them alongside the operational account and the targeting cell error and the verification process failure and the complete description of what the patrol found in the wrong building and what the patrol did there and what the patrol brought back from there that the combined campaign's operational record would not have been able to contain in any accessible form without the classification that buried it. The patrol went to the wrong building and did what the regiment does with buildings. The regiment does not describe what it does with buildings. The classification does not describe what was in the building or what the patrol did there. The Pentagon's silence covers the classification, and the classification covers the operational account, and the operational account covers the 400 meters, and the 400 meters covers the distance between what the combined targeting architecture produced and what the combined targeting architecture was designed to produce. And the distance is in the restricted archive, where it will remain until the classification is lifted or the review process determines that the sensitivity that justified the classification no longer justifies it, which may be a long time from now or maybe longer, depending on whether the operational environment the operation took place in continues to require the protection that the classification was originally applied to provide. The protection has held for the period since the operation. The operational environment has continued. The classification has not been lifted in any form accessible to this account. The operational record remains at its classification level. The patrol commander remains unidentified. The targeting cell officer remains unidentified. The building at the wrong coordinates remains unidentified. The district and the city and the country remain unidentified. The outcome of the clearance remains in the classification, where the Pentagon placed it in the 48 hours following the operation, when the decision was made that the accessible record was not the record that this outcome belonged in. The 400 meters is precise. The error that produced it was a transposition of 2 digits. The transposition of 2 digits moved the target 400 meters in the geography of the operational environment. The 400 meters moved the combined targeting architecture's product from the building the intelligence described to a building the intelligence had not described, and that the patrol entered and cleared on the basis of coordinates the targeting architecture had produced from an error that the verification process had not caught. The patrol entered and cleared a building it had been sent to on the basis of coordinates it had been given by a targeting architecture it had been working with across an operational campaign that had produced results both sides valued highly enough to have built and maintained and continued investing in, despite the specific night when the architecture produced coordinates that were wrong by 400 meters and sent the most capable direct action patrol in the coalition to the wrong building in a district of a city in a country that neither side's institutional record is prepared to identify in any public form. The 400 meters is in the record. The record is restricted. The restriction is the silence. The silence is the Pentagon's. The building is 400 meters from where the target was. The patrol cleared the wrong building. The outcome is classified. The combined record does not contain the sequence. The restricted archive contains the sequence in the form the classification permits it to be held. The archive holds the record and the gap and the classification that placed it there, where the oversight processes of the combined campaign cannot reach it, and where